Welcome back. In studio today, we have seasoned journalist and Africa analyst Ntate Tshepiso, and we will also be talking to social media expert Tonya Khuri, and she'll be joining us via Skype. And of course, our own digital news producer Tshepiso Moche will be telling us about social media and what is being said about the crisis in Zimbabwe. Well, good morning, gentlemen, lady, everybody who's here. And I think we're going to start off by looking at social media, but we will be joined later on by what Sophie Mokwena on the ground in Zimbabwe has to share with us. And we'll come back to all of that. But first, let's take a look at what's happening in the Sunday papers this morning. The people have spoken. That's the front page headline from the Sunday Times. They're leading with this as tens of thousands of Zimbabweans marched through the streets of Harare yesterday in an unprecedented mass protest demanding the removal of President Robert Mugabe after a week of turmoil led by army generals. The City Press, they also leading with Robert Mugabe, and it says several regional governments in Africa and abroad knew of the coup and gave assurances that they would not intervene. The Sunday Independent, they leading with the story about Mugabe's exile options, and this became very real yesterday as thousands of Zimbabweans took to the streets to demand the immediate resignation of Robert Mugabe. And looking at the Sunday Tribune, also leading with Mugabe's exile options and Zimbabwean leaders and considering exile in South Africa, Dubai and Singapore. The Weekend Argus is leading with the anti-Mugabe protests which took place in Harare, Cape Town, Johannesburg and London, where thousands of Zimbabwean citizens say that they are ready to go home if President Mugabe is removed. Well, Ntate Tshepiso, looking at all the papers, clearly this is the big story today, and various angles to the same story though.
Oh yes, oh yes. It's a big story and it's going to be an ongoing story, I think, for the whole month. Even after they've done whatever it is, there are many things that's going to happen. Blowout and fallouts. So for the whole month, it's going to be a top story.
And of course, I'll come back to you. In the meantime, think about whether this is a crisis or a coup or whatever else it may be that you want to term it. But let's take a look now, Tshepiso, at what social media has been saying about this. But before we get into the tweets, because those are all over the show, let's talk about the analytics that go with this. Just how prominent has the story been?
Sakina, this, the hashtag Zimbabwe, hashtag Mugabe, hashtag Harare was very big, not only in South Africa, also in other African countries. It was big, and by Wednesday, Sakina, it had, the hashtag Zimbabwe had reached over 2 million with just over 629 impressions. And that goes to show, Sakina, how big this hashtag has been, this story, the enormity of the story and the focus in Zimbabwe, and also on Google Analytics. On Wednesday morning, when we looked at Google Analytics, the search latest news on Zimbabwe, it had reached over 200,000 Google search. Now that goes to, again, Sakina, to show how big this Zimbabwe story is. And people are also want to know what the latest news is, because the latest news on Google search was also among the top search on Google Analytics.
So what are they saying exactly?
When Cohen saying Zimbabwe after Mugabe will probably move along the trajectory of constitutional legitimacy.
And I think that's an important term there, legitimacy, and we'll unpack it later on with our analysts. And then East and Horn Africa, Zimbabweans are celebrating Mugabe's fall as the 93-year-old leader tries to hold on to power.
Now, Sakina, this one is interesting because it shows the peacefulness of the march, saying no looting, no burning or overturning of police vehicles, no burning or destruction of clinics, no targeting foreign-owned businesses, no violence. The Zimbabwe march. Now I understand when I hear that Zimbabwe has the highest literacy in Africa.
And of course, the memes also are in overdrive this week, and this one was quite popular.
Sakina, there are plenty of memes. This one, I don't know who created it, but this this was when President Robert Mugabe had tripped and fell.
We remember
yes,
that.
And below that one is the President and his wife, Grace. This is it's a meme also of the two conversing.
An interesting one, the standoff there, Grace. And speaking of Grace, where is Grace? And Tate Homo, do you know where Grace is?
I don't know. Some say that he's in Namibia, and others say that he's hiding the country, but nobody knows.
Well, perhaps she's in Namibia, so, you know, that country that Donald Trump invented. Who knows? She might be there. And other than that, you know, were there any other angles that we have to this particular story?
Indeed, Sakina. Also, what we saw is that most tweets that were related to the story were from journalists based in Zimbabwe, not from the Zimbabweans themselves. We've seen a couple of tweets from prominent journalists, Trevor Ncube, Tula Sizwe Simelane, who are based in Zimbabwe. But interestingly, Zimbabweans themselves were not that big on social media. And I don't know whether that is a good or bad thing, but they were not big on social media. What we saw is that Zimbabweans who are in South Africa were the ones that were tweeting about events happening in Zimbabwe, as opposed to Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe tweeting about the events in Zimbabwe.
Very interesting. Tonya Khuri, of course, is also a media expert joining us via Skype. Tonya, thanks for speaking to us this morning. Well, as you've heard, you know, some of the impressions that were created, massive impressions on social media, this particular story. But what for you were the highlights?
So certainly an interesting week. We saw early this week how we woke up to the news, I think it was early hours of Monday morning, that Robert Mugabe and Grace Mugabe and the family was under house arrest. And the world went crazy, not only South Africa, but certainly this is an international story. Coming in at 51% of our social media conversation over the past week, South Africans did everything they could to search for news in Zimbabwe. There were a couple of things that certainly stood out for me. And the first was the lack of journalism coming out of Zimbabwe. I don't know if it's because the military took over the media houses in Zimbabwe or whether the journalists were scared to report. I'm not sure what the situation was exactly, but you'd see occasionally a story from Sky News or a story from CNN, and I wondered how much they paid for those stories because they were certainly in isolation. And then South African newsrooms struggled to report on the story. Even the lines with the people in Zimbabwe were very, very poor. So it left South Africans looking for information on social media, and that's really where we consumed the story this week.
We certainly did, but I think some did better than others because I remember speaking to Effort Musekiwa, our SABC correspondent, earlier in the week, and he was on top of things. You know, he drove around Harare trying to get as much information as possible, which proved to actually be the problem, trying to verify that information, because that brings us to that juxtaposition between social media and journalism in its true form. Because it's easy for someone to put a post out on social media. You don't have the responsibility to actually back it up and fact check it. But if you go out as the SABC, you need to be sure of the information that you're putting out.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's what was the biggest stumbling block for journalism coming out of Zimbabwe this week. Checking the facts, you know. Many people at home may not know, but journalists can't just put out a story. There needs to be a serious level of checking, and sources need to be confirmed, etc. But in social media, of course, anybody becomes a journalist, and anybody can carry whatever story they like, which leads to a lot of fake news. I mean, one particular instance this week that can highlight that is the whereabouts of so-called Gucci Grace. Everybody was wondering where she was.
Do you know?
Social media certainly speculated about her whereabouts, many saying she was in Namibia, But early social media conversations speculated about Zambia, but they seem to think she's in Namibia at the moment.
I think Donald is on to something, Tonya. She may be in Namibia. But you know, just staying with that for a moment and the importance of the state broadcaster in Zimbabwe. And it is a state broadcaster. It isn't a public broadcaster like the SABC. So when they take over the function, the army of the state broadcaster, what does that mean? Because where do you draw that line between what is propaganda and what is polemic, for instance?
Such a hard question, really. I think it was very apparent that once the military took over the newsroom in Zimbabwe, that the news was dissipated. You know, we saw the one news report where they said it wasn't a coup and that the family was safe, and that was about all. For days, we were left with just that, and I found it particularly frustrating, and it left me with nowhere else to go but to social media. And here's some top tips. I mean, from social media's perspective, we can identify what is fake and what is not by looking at how often the storyline is repeated with different images and different text. So it's not sharing the same fake news story over and over again, but many people reporting the same storyline. And that's about Zimbabwe, particularly yesterday. Was filled with Zimbabweans in celebration. And what struck me as the most poignant thing.
Okay, Tonya, we seem to be losing that signal slightly, but Tonya is going to be back with us after the break. And Tshepiso Moche will be joining us from the ground in Harare as well.
Can you check?